go. So good morning, folks, and delighted to welcome you here again to one of the Institute's masterclasses with our colleague Marc Coleman, who I'm delighted to have with us here this morning. And the first instance, Happy New Year. And I hope the coming year is a healthy one for both you, your families, and your clients and so forth, and colleagues. It's been an interesting start to the year thus far, and we're coming off the back of a very busy period last year, when we had a considerable number of these sort of events where we had some wonderful knowledge shared and the bar was set very high. So we're very fortunate this morning that Marc is going to recalibrate and reset the bar even higher for us and start the new year at a gallop. I guess from our perspective, we have people coming in from all over the world this morning. We have colleagues coming in from the subcontinent. We have students coming in from Asia and across all the university space. And indeed, we have professional members of the Institute also joining us in what will prove to be, I'm guessing, an insightful and interesting session here this morning, Marc, as Marc takes us through what your, I suppose, diagnosis of what the year ahead and perhaps thereafter is holding for us, just in a general kind of observation and what your sense of where the economy is, you know, where we're heading. And Marc, of course, needs no introduction. He's well known to you all, and indeed we're very fortunate. Marc is equally, through Octavian, is a member of the Institute in terms of an ACP house, and Octavian's gone from strength to strength in terms of the space you're in. I hasten to add that that is not a COVID cough, and no. We're both protected. We've been waxed, and we're willing to mingle at this point. So you don't have to kind of cover the lens or the cameras or anything like that. We won't be spreading anything over the internet to you. With that in mind, and I'm conscious of your time, folks, this morning, I'm conscious of Marc giving us of his time freely as well. Marc has I suppose, a presentation, I guess, in that instance, and we're going to go through that presentation. And then at the back end of that, we'll take a look at some questions that are coming in from the members attending and so on. We will be recording this. And we'll share it out with the members that are registered thereafter. And Marc has kindly said that he's happy for us to do that. But I'm conscious of GDPR regulations. And for those of you who may or may not be up to speed in that, if you have an issue of being recorded, I'd respectfully ask you to step off deck now as we are recording the thing. I'd also take this opportunity to welcome our president, Marita Kavanagh, who's joining us this morning virtually, and she sends her wishes and best regards, Marc. She would have been here herself, but unlike Padre Pio, she doesn't have the gift of biolocation, and commerce must come first, so she's joining us virtually, but she sends her kind regards, and indeed, as some members of the board are here, I note as well. So without further ado, Marc, I'll hand over to you, and I'll bring up your presentation if that's well, good with you, and we'll check it out from there. So if you'll bear with me a moment, folks, we'll just start the ship of state. And you forgive me, age is at me. I must put on my glasses to do this. And we will bring up Marc's presentation, which he's kindly shared with us. And pause that for a sec, Marc. We'll bring that up for you in a little bit more of a meaningful size and scale. Now, so that's the clicker there, Marc, and you can click right from there. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, everybody. And don't worry, this is not a COVID cough. This is a very much, it's -2 degrees outside. Kind of a cough, and thank you for organizing this.
Very welcome.
And delighted to be a member of the IMCA. It's a very important institution, particularly for consultants who want to strive for the best and work according to best practice and standards. So I certainly encourage anybody I meet to join the organization, and I would encourage everybody to be an evangelist for the cause in that sense. Looking back, looking forward, if this presentation appears to be a little bit biographical in terms of Octavian's activities, it's because we are living, eating, and breathing the economic destiny of the nation. It's exactly what we do. We provide consultancy for people who need to know what is going on, what is coming around the corner, and who need to engage in research, policy, publications, and stakeholder and public affairs engagement on those issues. So let me just say we have a mnemonic for what we do. PEPE is a Spanish name, Pepe. You should be able to remember it. And the first P stands for policy, research, and publications. The E stands for economic and environmental assessment. The second P stands for publication, and the third P stands for events. So that's basically what we do. There are some of our clients, not a full list, but you can see some familiar names there. I won't dwell on them. And the structure of this presentation is just a little bit more detail on what we do. It is not to hijack the presentation for a marketing promo, but it's literally that what we do tells the story of where the economy has gone in the last 3 years and where it's going. We'll take a look back 20 years in a mini presentation called 20 Years of Growing, because really I chose the name Octavian for the consultancy based on a series that some of you may have seen about 12 years ago. There was a series called Rome. It was a very good program set in ancient Rome. It was a sort of a drama soap opera starring Ciarán Hinds, and there was one character in it who's the survivor. And I said, well, this country has survived a lot of ups and downs in its history. There are more ups and downs coming. So I wanted to create a consultancy for those who want to survive and thrive through adversity. So that's what the name is about. And certainly the last 20 years has given us an example of that. And then I'll finish by looking at the next 3 years, starting with 2023, and what unfortunately I predict is a growing divide. So a little bit about what we do. I could condense the Pepe into three pillars just to make things a bit simple. Research on public policy and related publications, detailed environmental and sustainability appraisal, usually on a statutory basis, and then public affairs, stakeholder engagement, and events. We usually work on projects that are quite substantial. And so, for example, we're assisting the Department of Defense and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in relation to projects ranging from 140 to 250 million. But a sample output of the first pillar, policy and research and publications, would go from our very first publication, which was published within 5 weeks of the COVID crisis breaking out. It was published on the 7th of April, 2020. We worked overtime in 5 weeks to produce an 84-page substantial research analysis of what the COVID crisis was going to do to the economy and how government needed to respond. It had 7 specific recommendations. I won't go through all of them, but one of the key ones that was taken on board by government was to hold a July stimulus package for small business supports. We were the first to recommend that. I think we were the first in the world to publish an economic analysis of COVID. It was read by 3 cabinet ministers and over 10,000 people. It was published pro bono, and we reached out in a consultative and collaborative spirit to people in the public sector and private sector, and the SME Recovery Group took that book publication on board, and it inspired their very important engagement. And then the other 4 publications that you see are just samples of the variety of what we do. So the Greater Dublin Chamber of Commerce, comprising South Dublin, Fingal, Kildare and Dunleera Rathdown, asked us to produce a report on the needed investment in those specific areas to boost the economies that had obviously been hit by lockdown and by a decline in footfall. And then we have Designing a Lasting Localised Recovery for the Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland, which was about adequately resourcing public sector organisations, particularly local authorities, to support that reinvestment under the auspices of the National Development Plan. And that was a submission to the government's review to renew consultation. I believe it was the first consultation sent into the department. Then there's Saving Seafood and Harnessing Our Ocean Wealth, very important to us in Dunleera here. which helped to formulate the 142 million European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund allocation to Ireland 2 years ago. And then there's an analysis of Ireland's exports to the Arab world for the Arab Irish Chamber. On a more technical front, we've done work for the National Economic Social Council, for the Architects Council in Europe, for the Department of Defence and the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. These are usually based on technical analysis of statutory policy and policies like the EU taxonomy or professional regulation, where it's heavy duty, usually 200 to 300 page reports. Then we do lighter 5 to 10 page briefings, which are thought leadership, and climate action has been a particularly important one. And you can see some of the images of the client briefings we've sent out there, usually read by between 1,000 and 2,000 people. Coming to the public affairs front, we have supported the German Irish Chamber very proudly with their webinars, publications, and getting speakers. We have supported the expansion of logistics, employment, and enterprise zoning of land to deal with the bottlenecks that are emerging in our economy. And we have recently supported both ISMA and also the Irish Hairdressers Federation, respectively, in engaging with policymakers in Brussels, where I go from time to time, and also in making a submission on VAT. And then finally, we come to events, and you see a range of things we've done. We put together, and I personally chaired in English and my very limited Mandarin, a bilingual event with Enda Kenny, Minister Eamon Ryan, former EU President Pat Cox, Chinese Ambassador to Ireland, His Excellency, and Her Excellency, the Irish Ambassador to Beijing. And that was on EU-Chinese climate collaboration and the importance of preserving that against obvious geopolitical difficulties. So that's very high-end global policy stuff. You'll see on the top right a debate I had with the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Gabriel Makhlouf, in September of 2021, where I was forecasting that inflation would be much higher than the central bank forecasts. I formerly a monetary policy economist with the European Central Bank, so I keep an eye on inflation. And unfortunately, I was right. Inflation did turn out to be significantly higher. And unfortunately, the Central Bank of Ireland's forecasts turned out to be a little bit too optimistic. But that's me and the governor about 15 or 16 months ago. And then we've helped to organize and chaired various events such as the Irish Association of Corporate Treasurers Summit, the World Credit Managers Congress, which came to Ireland last year, and the Global Treasury Summit in London last summer. We aim to give our clients a combination of prestigious, influential, but also much more affordable than some of the other clients' work, because we are lean and mean. 20 years of growing, this is the looking back part. So since leaving the European Central Bank in 2004, immediately I did a scholarship MBA, and then became economics editor of the Irish Times. So I've been in the business of forecasting Ireland's economic, social, and in some cases political future for the last 20 years now. And it started by warning at the Dublin Economic Workshop in an ESRI paper, and indeed at a central bank conference in Prague, of the need to relax the Stability Pact rules on public investment so that we could invest in housing to meet Ireland's long-term demographic growth. And Back from the Brink, there's a book I wrote a few years after leaving the ECB, made that point very, very clearly. Unfortunately, as we've seen, it's been rather difficult for the policy system to respond to that. And we are now living 20 years later with a housing crisis and a potentially serious demographic and political crisis that results. I stated in that book, and in a book called The Best Is Yet to Come, that the ensuing period after crisis would be one of rapid growth, rapid demographic growth. There was a lot of skepticism. There were economists like David McWilliams, Morgan, what was his name? I forget the second name. Morgan Kelly, UCD professor, who predicted that there was going to be a much more savage and permanent decline in the property market and the economy. Thankfully, I was right. Our GDP grew by over 70% between 2014 and 2029. It nearly doubled in size since 2013. And as well as the broad macro forecasts and demographic forecasts and calling for long-term planning and house building in Back from the Brink and the Best is Yet to Come, I also authored and co-authored books such as Ireland and Germany, Partners in Recovery and Unlocking Asia's Trade Potential, to do more fine-tuned policy prescription in terms of turning GDP growth into jobs growth and regionally diverse jobs growth, and improving micro policies like skills, access to funding for SMEs, and a whole range of other areas, and particularly tapping into the German market even before Brexit and the Asian market. And more recently, in the last 3 years since setting up Octavian, you had mentioned the first book that Octavian produced, An Economic Response to COVID. Two other areas we've been concerned with is warning about inflation, which we did as early as May 2021. So really about a year before our policy institutions became alert to that. And another issue we've issued repeated warnings on, and elaborate a little bit more on that, is Ireland's twin track economy. I referred to the very impressive growth in gross domestic product between 2014 and 2019, over 70%. And that's a good news story, but it has had adverse effects on prices, on crowding out the SME sector of our economy, perhaps to a certain degree in having maybe a lot of influence on government, which in itself is not a bad thing, but perhaps government has been somewhat blindsided by the success of the multinational sector. And unfortunately, one of the crises that I see coming is that our indigenous economy sector is not very well resourced to lobby its case. And I've seen that working in IBEC. Business representation obviously follows the money, and politicians listen to the best resourced lobby groups. And they tend to be public sector trade unions and those representing larger, particularly multinational corporations. But the vast majority of our economy is made up of what I would call the little battalions, the micro businesses, people like us, basically, the mom and pop stores around the economy. And one of the real dangers I see is that, unfortunately, their policy concerns, which are escalating, costs of business, access to banking, crushing bureaucracy and regulation, they're really, really now becoming acute. And I'm going to focus on those. And I'm not going to give you a particular forecast on the global or European economy or Irish economy, because that is something that we do, unfortunately, for our paid consultants. I am absolutely delighted to engage with any of you who would like to become a client and who would like to access our thinking and our quantified forecasts. So what I'm going to stick to doing is giving you a broad brush feel for what's coming in the next 3 years. On housing and society, we have seen since 2018 a very well-intentioned and very, thought out attempt to solve the housing market through the Strategic Housing Development, the SHD legislation. Unfortunately, as we've seen within Board Planola, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And one of the features of the, two of the features that may need to be revisited if we're to solve the housing crisis is the assumption that only the private sector can crack the nut of rented accommodation. We are going to need a much more public infrastructure-led approach to housing. This is something I've been arguing for 20 years, since I wrote a paper arguing for the EU fiscal rules to be relaxed to enable more capital borrowing, not borrowing for current spending, but capital borrowing. And unfortunately, I think starting with the private sector means that the accommodation that has been provided, if first of all, is not being planned centrally. So we're seeing high rise in outlying areas of Dublin and other areas, cities, which is not economically efficient and environmentally very damaging. Whereas what I've argued for in 2 books is to cluster high rise in the center of cities, because it's more conducive to cycling, to walking. It's more conducive to the rollout of supportive utilities and public amenities, everything from schools to medical supports. It's more conducive to bringing young people into city centres and bringing footfall in, which benefits retail and cafes and restaurants. You get a virtuous circle. The SHD story has been the opposite. It has replicated for high-rise apartments the kind of sprawl, dysfunctional sprawl that we saw with housing estates in the Celtic Tiger. So we need to revisit that. It's also, unfortunately, despite its well-intentioned approach, it has delivered apartments that are unaffordable to all but the top 10 or 15% of the population. So expecting local communities to buy into it when the people from a local community will not be able to afford to live in those apartments is not really either socially or politically realistic. And that is why that policy is coming up against intense resistance. You can argue that local people are being NIMBYs, but there is an element of Bertolt Brecht, who is the one satirist who was allowed to write under the former dictatorship in East Germany, and he was allowed to sardonically remark that the regime in East Germany could keep complaining about the population not being sufficiently enthusiastic about socialism, and he suggested that perhaps at the next Communist Party Congress, instead of electing a new government, that the government could elect a new population that might be more supportive of its aims. Where we economists give advice to government, we always say that when public opinion and public opposition reaches a certain critical mass, you can keep wagging your finger and saying that they're NIMBYs, but realistically, policy is like politics. It's the art of what is possible. And if you're coming up against widespread opposition, there may be cynical and unpleasant motives for that, but it is also realistically the fact that you can't have policies that are against the majority of the population. So I think on housing society and society, we finally need a fundamental reevaluation, and perhaps to go back to what our ancestors did. A lot of criticism of Ireland in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, and indeed there were ugly attributes of that time. But one of the things Ireland in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s was able to do very well was provide affordable housing accommodation. We are now a €500 billion economy. Our GDP is over €500 billion a year. And I think if we cannot solve this problem, then we are in for an extremely severe decade of discord. The second area where I'm deeply concerned is in relation to the level of bureaucracy, the level of, frankly, dysfunctional engagement between SMEs and the banking sector. I've represented the banking sector. I'm very proud to have done so. Very good people working in a very difficult job. And I think through no fault of the domestic banks, well, through some fault, but not a lot of the domestic banks, we are now seeing a confluence of 3 things that are beginning to deepen a crisis in the SME and the indigenous economy. One of those is a very rigid approach to regulation coming from Frankfurt, which again is well intended, but may lack sensitivity. And I've spoken about the Stability Pact and the fiscal rules, which really constrained our ability to borrow when we had a growing population. And we're very different from Germany and France in that respect. They had declining populations. We needed capital borrowing. They didn't. We needed that area of flexibility. Likewise, Ireland has a rapidly growing economy and still a growing demography. We should be actually able to borrow more, because economies that are growing and younger should have a higher debt profile. That is natural and that is healthy. but I'm concerned that the regulatory system may be operating in an overly one-size-fits-all manner. That is interacting with profound structural change in the banking market. We've seen KBC and Ulster Bank leave. And I have a lot of sympathy for the great staff that are working in those two institutions. I also have sympathy for the management in those institutions who, it's not easy being a manager in a branch. But when you compare the regulatory issue I've spoken about with that structural change and transition, with then the technological revolution in banking, where arguably the shift to online banking has gone too far and is trying to replicate some of the things that really need to be done face-to-face. I think in the coming year, when we're facing a recession, and I'm going to finish talking about that, we're going to see small businesses need more working capital requirements. Indeed, they already do. They're going to need bridging loans. We are going to need to see credit markets playing the role that they should do in difficult times of short-term correction in providing credit, and that doesn't appear to be happening. So we have a $500 billion economy, but the amount of credit extended to the SME sector, indeed the business sector at large, is barely 5% of that. That's something we need to look at. And then finally, what I call the twin track economy, which is the divide between our SMEs and the FDI. I completely salute the Industrial Development Authority. It's been an amazing success. It has wonderful staff that I've been very proud to work with, promoting a more regional strategy for FDI. It is sometimes possible to be so successful that you create problems that need to be dealt with. In the 1960s and 70s, the Dutch experienced a problem called Dutch disease, which is a word for the phenomenon that they found oil and gas off their coast, which you would think was a great boon, but it had the negative side effect of that it brought so much money into the Dutch economy that smaller Dutch businesses found it impossible to get staff or very difficult. They found their costs rising. So it created severe problems for the other sectors of the Dutch economy. I think we are seeing elements of that, and that is exacerbated by what I call a decade of underinvestment, or a lost decade of public investment. In the book I mentioned, An Economic Response to COVID, I analyzed the period between 2008 and 2018. That was in the period in which my first two books, I argued that we needed to open the vaults and invest in the capital side. As one of the basic rules you learn in economics is preserve your capital stock as a ratio of your economy. So if your economy has grown, as it has, by 70% between 2014 and 2019, then our stock of capital needs to increase by a corresponding amount, because capital stock is the foundation of economic activity. And if your economy becomes too big for your capital stock, well, it's like building a bigger house without extending the foundations accordingly. Something unpleasant is going to happen. Now, the private sector has increased its investment in capital accordingly, but unfortunately, the concomitant and necessary parallel improvement on the public infrastructure side has not happened. There are logistical and legal and administrative barriers to that, but they are not an excuse. They are obstacles that need to be overcome. And here I think we need to reform the public sector recruitment system. It is overly cumbersome. It blocks access to smaller, more efficient operators. And we need to complement the excellent skill set in the public sector. I've had the pleasure of working with many great public servants, but I do think our public sector system is going to need to bring in complementary and supportive senior skill sets from the private sector to help unlock some of those barriers. And if that doesn't happen quickly, we are not going to build the houses or the infrastructure that we need to avoid potentially serious political and social fallouts. And I'll finish by saying that two things. One is the outlook for the coming year. The good news is that inflation is coming down. and will continue to come down. We were probably the first forecaster in the world to predict rampant inflation. We did so in May. We tried to get the Institute of European Affairs to have an event on this, but they didn't. We flagged it to the Dublin Economic Workshop. We suggested that they set up that debate, and fair dues to Governor Gabriel Makhlouf, who very bravely stepped in and did that debate with me in September 2021. And we persistently warned anyone who would listen on that. So we have, I think, the credibility now to say that there is good news in the pipeline, and that we're going to see the rate of inflation come down the next year. Unfortunately, the European Central Bank believes that interest rates will need to keep rising. Now, my own view is that while I've always argued interest rates needed to rise during the 2014 to 2019 period, in my book, Back from the Brink, I argued that as a former European Central Bank economist myself, I argued that the European Central Bank needed to recalibrate rates from 0 back to something like 2.5% or 3%, and that it needed to do so in the 7 years following the end of the last global financial crisis, so starting from 2013. That was my own prescription. Had that been followed, the increases that we would have seen in the last 6 or 7 months would have occurred over a 6 or 7 year period, not a 6 or 7 month period. And they would have occurred at a time from around about the end of 2013 to 2020, in time for the pandemic. That would have enabled the ECB to give some more effective support for the market during the pandemic. Unfortunately, that action wasn't taken neither in Frankfurt nor in the Fed. So we are now seeing a very squeezed monetary policy reaction that does not really, in my view, match what needs to be done. I would contend that there really isn't a need for more monetary policy action in the coming year or two. Unfortunately, the European Central Bank does not agree with that. I very much respect that conclusion. And as a result, we will get a domestic recession in Ireland lasting at least 18 months, in my view. It will have less impact on the multinational sector, which is more resilient to interest rate increases, but this is going to aggravate the gap in incomes, in employment, and stability and working conditions between what is now becoming an increasingly black and white multinational economy and a domestic economy. And I can link that back to the housing market. There is plenty of demand for the 600,000, 700,000 euro apartments that are being built under the sort of private sector dominated strategy of housing. That's because there's an endless influx of people on 120, 130, 140 grand a year working for the Googles and the Facebooks and LinkedIns. Now, there's some prospect of job losses relative to where we were last year, but even so, the 250,000 or so people working in the high tech industry are enough to keep demand for those apartments going. So, you know, there is that demand there. Unfortunately, it is a completely different world from the vast majority of people upon whom the economy still relies for employment and the bulk of its tax receipts, and you and I for our customers, the SME bulwark of our economy. For the employees in those areas, unfortunately, that strategy doesn't work. And we are not yet meeting the needs of that silent majority economy. And that is my big concern. And my even greater concern stems from that, is that after a domestic recession, which will last 12 to 18 months, we will be heading into a general election in early 2025. Now, I get on with and talk to people from all political backgrounds. I'm formerly active in a political party, but that was 25 years ago, and I have absolutely no affiliations now.
We won't hold that against you.
Yeah, but my concern, my serious concern is with the overall fragmentation of the system. And I have been noticing and writing analyses for the last 20 years that there, even before the current crisis, there was a structural breakdown in the Civil War party system, which is a natural consequence of cultural and demographic change. So in 2004, I showed a paper to the then Finance Minister, Brian Cowan, saying, look, the joint share of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is now down to 60%. It used to be 90%. There's something long-term going on. And what we saw at the last general election was a very substantive further breakup of the stability of the system. Now, I'd written an article in the Sunday Independent on, I think, the 13th of July, 2019. It was one of the first things I did after leaving IBEC, warning that if we didn't invest in public housing, we would lose a young generation who would have nothing to believe in the system and who would feel that the ladder has been pulled up. And unfortunately, that was not heeded in time. And the results were seen 7 months later in the general election result. We have seen very welcome moves by Darragh O'Brien and the government to respond to that. The problem is the lack of reform in the public sector means that with the best will in the world, and despite the very good public servants we have, the rigidities in the system will make it very difficult to implement the National Development Plan. We need to be spending 10 billion a year on housing. That is relatively small. That, by the way, is 2% of our gross domestic product, not much more than that. So it's not a huge, it sounds a lot, but it's not a lot. That's what we need to be, really. And we're not there. And there are concerns about logistical barriers, but we need to overcome them instead of just accepting them. We need to be reforming and dealing with this, because if we don't, then the February 2020 general election could look like a paragon of stability compared to what we are facing in 2 years' time. And it took, I will leave with a final warning. I remember when I had published an economic response to COVID, I had 2 cabinet ministers approaching me who were engaged in government negotiations, seeking a copy of it. I happily provided it. I didn't charge anything for it. It was for the public good. But I published my report in April 7th, 2020. It took a further 8 weeks for government to negotiate the programme for government. That meant that from the February date of the general election 2020, it took 4 months to form a government. My concern is that the opinion polls are disguising a significant breakdown in the core vote of some of the parties, and that it may actually not be possible to form a stable government, a government that will last more than a year after the next election. I don't care what ideological colour. I'm a consultant. I'm politically neutral. I don't get into left or right or Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or Sinn Féin or not Sinn Féin. I'm absolutely neutral and professional on that. My concern is about the overall ability of the Oireachtas to stably manage the 5 years that follows 2025. And I will conclude with a positive suggestion. I know that we've passed the 100th year of independence. Some would say it's the 103rd year. They would look to the Dáil for a sitting in 2019 in January. I have a lot of sympathy for that view. But let's take 2022 for argument's sake as the 100th anniversary of the state's foundation. I think that a number of issues now need to be looked at. First of all is the Ministers and Secretaries Act. We have great civil servants. I was a civil servant. I've had the pleasure of working with them in the civil service and outside it. I think many civil servants are as frustrated as non-civil servants are with the lack of public sector reform. It's as much about releasing the amazing potential of the public service as it is getting policy done faster. And I think that next year will be the 100th anniversary of the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924. I really think it's high time we need to look at that, because our current system puts all the responsibility on the minister. It's the minister's head on the block if something goes wrong. Now, that's as it should be, but the minister then has to be able to hold the people who work with him and for him to account as well. If the chain of responsibility only stops at the minister, then no matter how good the minister, the whole system isn't going to work. So my first positive proposal for the long term is look at the Ministers and Secretaries Act. My second comment is on the electoral system. The single transferable voting model of proportionate representation in a very divided country after the Civil War. And aspects of it may need to be preserved in the United Ireland. But in terms of financial and government policy, a German or Dutch list system of public representation is much, much more effective, in that the current system gives the whip hand to the most indecisive voters in the country, or to the most, and I see this as a lobbyist, it gives the influence to the most organized lobby groups. And lobby groups are very important. They're an essential part of democracy, but their actions are not always in the interest of the public interest. And on the housing market, in some instances, they have in fact gone against the public interest, not through ill will or malice, but just because their own self-interest was not necessarily what the public needed. So I think our electoral system is going to have to be examined, and that reform there would enable ministers to be appointed more on merit, more on competence, less on what constituency they have. And it will also allow general elections to produce majorities that are in favor of specific and decisive actions, rather than forming a coalition based on electoral results on the 10th, 11th, or 12th count of a constituency, where people are thinking on the 10th and 11th and 12th count, they're probably thinking about something very different from the national interest. And then the final comment is on the need, I think, for greater taxpayer and small business voice. An unfortunate feature of our political system compared to the German system, which I look to as a model. In Germany, they have regional elections every year. Or a couple of months, there's a regional election somewhere. And that is a healthy check and a balance on government and prevents government from straying too far. In America, they have midterm elections for the Senate and the House of Representatives. And again, that's a healthy check and a balance. Really, what happens in Ireland is the voters get a vote once every 5 years. The Senate is then a rubber stamp election. It doesn't act as a check and balance. It happens too soon after the general election. I think we need to put the Senate elections, and I ran for the Senate in 2012, I think we need to put the Senate election right between the two general elections, so that the people have a vote. And if government policy is going in a direction with which the public are not happy with, that there can be a corrective action. That would be good for government, it would be good for policy, it would be good for the public. I note with extreme concern that in the Dublin Bay South by-election of 2020, and was it 2021, excuse me, the Dublin Bay South election of July 2021, 65% of voters did not bother to vote. Now that compares with the 2009 by-election where George Lee won a seat in Dublin South. It was the most comparable election because it was a year after a crisis breaking out. It had a celebrity candidate, George Lee, who was on RTE a lot. Ivana Bacik is also on RTE a lot. And it had an affluent and well-educated electorate. And yet in Dublin Bay South in 2019, 60% of the voters turned out to vote. In Dublin Bay South, barely a third of voters bothered to vote. And then in the Trinity Senate election, again, where I ran, received 12%, highly erudite, educated electorate, 80% of people did not vote. That is alarming, and that speaks to a growing number of people who do not feel they are represented. I don't care how to represent them. Are they left? Are they right? I have my own analysis on that. But my deep concern as a policymaker and as a consultant is that I need to talk to politicians that have a strong representative base. And when I talk to the media, I need to know that the media is well connected with the people, because if neither of those things are true, then when I approach the public and when I approach politicians on my client's behalf, I am not sure that they can deliver, and I'm not sure that they have the power that they need to have to implement policy. And I will say one tactic, one strategy indeed that I'm now employing, and I'll finish up on this point, and a little kind of hint, a free sort of suggestion I would give to any of you that are out there in the space that I am. What I am seeing more and more and more, with no disrespect to my very valued colleagues who are working in the national broadcast and print media, where I worked for 10 years. I was economics editor of the Irish Times. I was a News Talk broadcaster. I was a Sunday Independent columnist. So I very much value the good work that those institutions do. And long may they endure. I was delighted to see the VAT rate fall to 0% for newspapers. But what I am seeing is more and more people around the country are reverting to local media, local newspapers and local radio stations, which they trust more. What I would call the Dublin 4 narrative seems to be drifting further and further away from the populace, and that is a very dangerous development. So that's about it. I'm sorry that I can't end on a more positive note.
Thank you, Mark. It is food for thought. I think you've given us a huge tour de force across multiple kind of areas in terms of SME, housing, the banking sector, and so on. And, you know, to your point, there is a theory that has been hypothesized, you know, on this forum here as well, that in terms of voting, for example, that, you know, the state probably needs to take a more engaged aspect in terms of the educational system and maybe bring back civics. You know, and actually explain to people that they have a duty of care as citizens to actually engage in the political process. It's incumbent on people to engage. We get the politicians we deserve, or indeed we vote for. So if you're not voting, you know, it's very hard to be giving out after the event. And you know, tragedies can arise and unfold as a consequence of unintended consequences and people not turning up on the day to vote. So that there is that theory, and people have said it. I'm taken by a lot of the points you've made, and I guess our own audience, which would be spread over the large APC houses and you know, the academic side as well, which we have a big cohort. But probably the heartbeat of the organization is the niche, uber niche, and SME consultant operations, which really are very much focused in the space and very agile and very kind of conscious of what lays ahead. And your points to the next 12 and 18 months in terms of the domestic economy certainly raises flags, and they'll take that on board in terms of their planning process over the next kind of year and so on. Interestingly, you know, and we all see the administrative burden increasing from a regulatory point of view in terms of the financial and access to finance and so on in the banking sector. You know, do you see a role, for example, in terms of the state, and you know, you kind of alluded to it in terms of maybe the state stepping in more proactively in terms of going back to that house building model that the county councils would have done or something like that, or an agency therein. But do you see, I suppose, we have the Strategic Banking Corporation, if we'd say that, but do you see a role for a commercial domestic state-owned bank stepping into the SME sector?
Had you asked me that question about 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said no. Although in one of the books that I wrote, and there was an icon of it up on the presentation, it was called Ireland, Germany, Partners in European Recovery. So it's not a thrilling poolside read. It was a technical book. But one of the very good suggestions it had was it was trying to see what we could learn from Germany, and also what Germany could learn from us, because it was a two-way exchange. And one of the clever things the Germans did after, you know, the Second World War was they realized the importance of social cohesion, and how the small business community was going to be vital to Germany's recovery. And there was a great man called Ludwig Erhard, who pioneered what we call the German Mittelstand.
Yeah, familiar with that.
And access to finance was a very important part of that. And the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, which was the bank set up for reconstruction, Wiederaufbau is to reconstruct in German, was set up with great success and funded the SME recovery and the Mittelstand that is now the backbone of Germany's economy. I did stand up with Willie Penrose and advocate in 2013 it was a meeting in Mullingar Chamber that we create something similar here, and that led to the thinking behind the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland, which does very good work. I think fundamentally we need a more German style banking system, much more competitive. There are issues there as to how we treat residential markets. In terms of mortgages, banks would say, you know, we're a bit constrained in terms of, you know, attracting competitors on that front. But fundamentally, I think, yes, we are at a point now where through no ill will or bad intent, the combination of the three forces I mentioned, which is a very centralized regulation model that in some way is looking at the rear view mirror while driving the car. Number two, structural change in the banks and management change in the banks over the last year or two. And three, I suppose, maybe an excessive, aggressive strategy of assuming that everything can be done online in banks. And we're learning now that it can't. We're learning that you do need stable relationships to open an account, to get a loan. There are some things where you need to be going in and somebody needs to be doing the stuff for you rather than you trying to do it online. And I'm afraid that those three things, each of them were foreseen individually, but what we didn't foresee was the how the three of them would come together and produce what I think is now a crisis in terms of banking and access to credit. And it's unfortunate for the banks because they've suffered as much as we have, believe it or not. I know great people working in banking. They've lost their jobs. They've worked 70 or 80 hours. So they are under as much pressure as we are. So I think we need a dialogue on this, a constructive dialogue with the likes of the BPFI. I think we need to resource dialogue. One of the things I notice, and I'm really,
do you see, I suppose, a role for state banks stepping in?
I think we have to look at that option. Yeah, I wouldn't say definitively that it should.
Or a credit union model, for example, ramping up.
But yeah, I think that could be actually, that could be the first step. But I really seriously think we are going to have a big debate about domestic banking in this country. The narrative is that it's just a few elderly people, who need to be re-educated into the ways of mobile apps. That unfortunately is not the case. And I would seriously warn anyone in the banking community or policymaking in the central bank from assuming that. There are highly, highly intelligent, capable business people who are tearing their hair out at the current system. And it's not a question of basically telling people that they're stupid or that they need to be educated. We have to actually listen to the front line, because my concern is that if we don't, we could get the advocacy of a kind of an extreme negativity, the sort of the burn the bondholders mindset, that would actually be bad for us and would be bad for our reputation internationally.
Okay.
And if that happens, it really will be a failure to listen.
Well, there is, and indeed, I think one of our colleagues has just said that they wholly agree that the banking sector needs to reinvent itself. They've lost the customer focus, and that's a sad good, Mark, in terms of your comments in regard to meter staff. I would say, in terms of one of our other colleagues has said, just generally a forecast for house prices over the next 5 years, up, down, across.
Yeah, well, a little bit down, but not substantially down. I think it's like blowing the froth off a pint of beer. Given the demographic demand, I would say some scale back, but no more than 5 to 10%.
Okay.
Really blowing the froth off. They've gone a little bit too far. One of the things I would watch is the amount of volume in the market is quite small. So when prices were at their bottom 10 years ago, I warned that the reason for that was low volumes, and that when you have low volumes of trading, the price doesn't really tell you much. So I would say the same again. Now we have high prices. I would say it's a little bit over the top because there's so few houses being traded. I would say go down 5-10%, and that's a solid floor that can be defended. Okay, conscious of your time, Mark. Pop quiz, 3 quick questions. Okay, what's your number one concern for the year ahead? My number one concern, quite frankly, is civic cohesion. Okay. Because more and more people who are of a very conservative, traditional, conventional bent are expressing exasperation. I'm talking about small business people. I get that, complete exasperation that the policy system only reflects the views of either the public service elite or the corporate elite. That does not do justice to the people who are in the policy system. They're all good and decent people doing their best, but unfortunately there is a real disconnect there. And I feel that ministers who are very, by and large, good people, decent people, dedicated people, are not hearing the voices they need to hear. That's concern number one. Only one? Oh, only one. Only one. Okay. So the second thing is, if you had a golden ticket, Mark, and you were talking to the government over the year ahead, and you had a golden wish, what would be the one thing you would say? My number one thing I would say to them is that the false narrative that happened after the 2016 election, that we didn't need tax cuts, we needed public services. What we now know from the National Children's Hospital is that the higher taxes, the austerity taxes that were imposed, were not retained to provide public services. We can see that from the waiting lists. They went into overspend on waste.
Okay.
So just as we restore, I was delighted to see the public sector get wage restoration of 2008 norms. I was delighted to see a restoration and an end to public spending austerity. So the golden thread is now, years after it should have happened, we need to end the tax austerity that was imposed. And to put figures on it, in between the 2008-2013 crisis, the government increased taxes, discretionary taxes, by 12 billion and constrained spending by 12 billion. The spending constraints were more than reversed. We've had more than twice that corrected.
Yeah.
But most of the tax increases are still on the books.
So
we have a domestic economy in crisis. The energy credits are good, but we need to be putting back much more money into domestic economy, particularly now that the domestic economy is so squeezed by interest rate increases and unintentionally, despite the goodwill of the multinational sector, being crowded out by the success of that sector, which we all welcome, of course.
Which is welcome. And we have a golden rule in the house, Mark, that we get them in and get them out within the hour. So I'm conscious of your timeline. The final question is a more kind of socialized question, I suppose, in general, and there's no right or wrong answer. And I'm going to put you on the spot. You know, we've all gone through a cathartic experience over the last 36 months since March 2020. You know, what one thing did you learn that you didn't know before you entered COVID about yourself, about kind of life in general, you know?
Well, I think I learned that face-to-face contact does actually make a difference.
Okay.
There was a guy, he was an American Armenian, whose name escapes me. He was a social scientist who said, and we've all learned this on some course or some MBA or some, you know, self-development course. We've all been told that 10% of communication is the actual data, that the voice, the words, the words that you're using, the grammar and so on. And that 90% of it is body language, ambiance, facial expression. And really what I learned in COVID is that that is absolutely true. It makes an enormous positive, productive difference if people are in the same room. Having said that, I think it also is good to give people the flexibility. So hopefully we're heading into a hybrid model where we'll get the best of both.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. It's really been a great start to the new year for us. You've set the bar very high. That was a tour de force, a gallop through the year ahead and going back to 20 years of growing. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you this morning. Thank you for affording us your time, and perhaps we'll have you back again to maybe cast your eyes forward and back and see where your kind of thought process kind of has crystallized, and you know where we're looking at maybe next year. But in the meantime, on behalf of all the members who are here this morning and they'll be watching this on the recording, Gur Míle Magat. I hope you and your family have a healthy new year and a productive one.
Thank you. And just if it's not too shameless, if anybody wants to consult our website, it's www.octavian.ie. I'd be delighted to hear from anybody we could serve their needs. Just get in touch.
Well, as good management consultants, we love a good plug. So on that high note, we will leave. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you.